So here we are for our third, wow, time flies. We're here for our third 19th century baseball speaker series, second Tuesday of every month. I'll say a little bit more about our programs that are coming up in the next couple of months. I think or at least I saw Tom Schieber and Don Jensen on here. They're two of our presenters. Joanne Holbert's here, who presented last month, and Jonathan Popovich presented our lead-off session in October. I want to say that they are kind of typical of the Fred Conference research presentations. And the people that we did select actually had presented these programs before at the Fred. And there was an opportunity for more people to share in that. We have somewhat of a limited capacity there at the Hall of Fame. However, I'm going to turn it over to Bob now, who will introduce Bill Humber, who is our speaker this evening. And Bill in himself is worth he's worth a research presentation himself. But Bob, I'll let you kick it off then.
Thank you. Before we do that, just we will be muting everybody here when Bill brings up his slides and starts the presentation. However, use the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom screen and type in any questions, comments, or bank account numbers, whatever it is that is useful for us, and we will direct those to Bill at the end of the program. Bill Humber is a native of Toronto and currently resides in Bowmanville, Ontario, part of the greater Oshawa-Whitby metropolitan area. Bill holds degrees from the University of Toronto and York University in environmental science. He has spent the bulk of his career teaching and running programs at Seneca College in Toronto, including serving as director of the college's Eco Seneca initiative. Bill's been a member of SABR for 42 years and has been an active participant in the 19th Century Committee's activities. He's been a regular presenter at the Frederick Ivor Campbell 19th Century Conference, including a delightful demonstration of his cricket acumen, where he demonstrated the proper technique to deal with a wicked googly. He's the author or co-author of 10 books, 5 of which are about baseball, including Diamonds of the North and All I Thought About Was Baseball. In 2018, his contributions to Canadian baseball were recognized through his induction to the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. His topic tonight is A Thoroughly Modern Ballplayer, The Imaginative, Illicit, and Improbable Life of Bob Addy. I give you Bill Humber. Go ahead.
And my slides, I trust, are showing. We are set to go. So for page 1, now I've deliberately put it in this horrifying script because for any of us who read enough material from the 19th century, we know that horrifying script is something that we're dogged with all the time. The second thing I note about it is that it's an incredibly wordy sentence, and any of us who read 19th century materials, particularly the descriptions of books and essays, know that long descriptions go with the territory. And finally, it is the worst possible thing a presenter can do to read, in fact, what is in fact on the page itself, and which everyone can read, but I'm going to read it anyway. So this is the improbable, illustrious, and illicit Canadian who didn't want to be known as such, and so the tinner from Port Hope lied, deceived, and behaved in a truly awful manner. But on the ball field, he was an annoying, prodigious, and brave talent who played with some of the great teams and players of his era before, like Samuel Clemens, He lit out for the territory of the West and reinvented himself. So I could not have done this I could not have done my research were it not for the inestimable work of Peter Morris. And Peter put the Bob Addy story in its full glory, as it were, on the SABR biography site. For my part, I did read Fred Case's book, The Boston Braves, part of the Putnam series. This book came out in 1948, and it clearly says, Case clearly said, Robert Addy, a Canadian who had not played in 1872, but previously starred for the Forest Cities. And I'm sure, I don't know this for certain, when I read that piece, I looked in the notable authorities, baseball encyclopedias, saw Bob Addy was listed as having been born in Rochester, New York, and gave it no further thought, which is, to my criticism, nobody else's criticism. So to Peter and his work, I'll refer to it actually as I proceed through here, because there are many aspects of what he did and some of the questions he raised that I think I have now, with a certain degree of assurity, been able to confirm or at least give further information on. So here, I'm getting these messages coming up. Here is our Mr. Addy, center spread. On his right, as we look at it, is of course Albert Spalding. And we know that Bob Addy played with not only Albert Spalding, but Adrian Cap Anson, two of the notable baseball personalities of the 19th century. At the bottom is Robert Addy's autograph, believe it or not. I don't have Bob Addy's autograph. This was in the, let me just get rid of that. This was in the probated will that Bob Addy signed off on in 1889. And I'm sure that the original they tossed in the garbage and put the form, as it were, on a microfilm. The playing ball that is above him is actually from the 1803 account written by a gentleman named Eli Plater, a tavern keeper in Toronto, who claimed to be playing ball in the city of Toronto in what was actually the town of York, I should say, probably more likely the hamlet of York, which eventually, of course, became the city of Toronto. So, okay. So where do we begin with Bob Addy's story? Because it's a kind of a remarkable story in large respect. He spanned such a long period of time in baseball history. I dispute the claim or the comment that Tom Gilbert makes in this wonderful book. And if you haven't got it and haven't read it, rush out and get it immediately, How Baseball Happened. But Tom argues that the 1616, I think it was, game, I think I've got it here. Yes, the 1717 game, I should say, with John Morrissey's Troy Haymakers was the closest the Red Stockings came to losing. But I would argue this is the game actually with the Forest Cities of Rockford, Illinois, that was the closest they came to losing in the midst of their streak. They were down by 2 runs in the 9th inning with 1 out, and they rallied to win the game. But that was getting as close as they possibly could. And the game was notable for a variety of reasons, many of which featured Bob Addy. One of them, one of the reasons he was featured was because as the catcher for Forest City, sitting as he was, squatting as it were, behind home plate, with very little protection, perhaps a piece of leather stuck in his teeth, he took a foul ball flat in the face. Must have been going at a tremendous rate. It knocked him out. It undoubtedly concussed him. As they say in hockey terms, he probably lost a few chiclets, but he actually recovered. And in a couple of innings, he came up to bat and he hit a home run over the center fielder's head. But what made his performance in the game particularly notable was this little comment down in the corner where it indicates that he had this terrible habit when he, in this case, attempted to throw out a runner at second base, to yell, or as it says here, put out a sharp, shrill shriek of "How's that?" And when I first read that, I said, what the heck what was that all about? Well, what it was all about is that come on, there we go. What that was all about is that how's that, or how's it, is actually a term from cricket. And in cricket, and this again was something I hadn't realized, and I sometimes wonder if perhaps early baseball had elements of this. And certainly for those who remember Game 5 of last year's World Series and the appeal play, which cost the Atlanta Braves a run. I think I remember the circumstances. As I recall, Mookie Betts made a great catch in right field. And the runner, of course, took off a little too early from third base and was out on appeal. And it's one of the few plays in baseball where the umpire could see the error, the miscue, as it were, the foul, the incorrect adventure, shall we say, on the part of the field or the player, the runner, but not actually bring it to anybody's attention unless it was appealed. And in cricket, according to Rule 31, virtually all calls are like that. In other words, most calls would be fairly clear as to whether the batter was out or not. If the ball was caught on the fly, if the batter swung and missed and hit the wicket and the wicket was knocked over, it would be clear. But if there was any debate or any discussion as to whether that was an out or not, it is up to the defending team, the team for which has bowled the ball, to actually appeal the play to the umpire, and he has to make a call on that. And so that's a fairly common practice, and it must have been obviously a practice in those days too. And it makes me, and I can't answer this question, I simply pondered as I wondered how much of the early umpire's role in baseball was of an appeal kind of nature, where they had to appeal to the umpire for a call. I don't know if they did or not. I'm just kind of out there speculating that given so many inheritances, as it were, from cricket to baseball, that might have been the case. So, there we go. I'm gonna go, okay. The only reason I have "How's It" there is that that's an Australian hair band from the 1970s who have a song about how's it in cricket. And so if anybody is so inclined to pursue them, by all means do so. So this is the Port Hope that Bob Addy was born into in 1842. There's the picture on the right, obviously, is of a pretty tiny and insignificant little village in 1841. The Addy family had arrived in Port Hope sometime after the birth of oldest brother George in 1837 from Ireland. They were Protestants, which probably meant they had a little bit better life in Ireland, but life in Ireland for anyone was not particularly great in those days. And so they moved to Canada. They came to Canada and they settled in Port Hope. And that's significant for a variety of reasons that become kind of apparent when you look at this map. Port Hope is about 60 miles east of Toronto, and it is, I don't know if it's showing up on your screen or not. I hope so, because down in the right-hand corner is Rochester. So it gives a little bit of an idea where Port Hope is relative to these other cities. You can see Buffalo on the bottom of the screen. You can see where Toronto is and Hamilton. And virtually all of the significant baseball activity in Ontario, in this part of Canada at that time, was west of Hamilton. It was to places not even on the map, as it were, tending towards Detroit, about at least halfway from Hamilton to London, with Guelph, Ingersoll, Woodstock, and places like that in between. So that's kind of an intriguing piece that Bob Addy would have come out, and as the first kind of Canadian to make his mark in baseball in the United States, it's kind of amazing that he actually came out of this place. But perhaps not so. In 1803, the Historical Atlas of this part of the world actually said that a game of ball had been used to decide some matters associated with who would provide dinner for a court. They say here it was a court of Queen's Bench. Actually, it was a court of quarter sessions. And I had reasons to be dubious about it. This account in the Northumberland Durham Historical Atlas is from 1878, in other words, 75 years after the fact, and was based on actually another account that had appeared in a smaller publication in 1875. But there were two reasons I at least give it some credence. One is that one of the witnesses to this 1803 court was the son of one of the jurors at the trial. He was the 14-year-old Leonard Soper, who was still alive in 1875 and could conceivably have remembered and told that story. The other is that the presiding judge was a guy named McGregor Rogers. And McGregor Rogers was the brother-in-law of this guy, Eli Plater, who also in 1803, and you can see it about kind of the middle of the page there, the notion of talking and playing ball. It's not much to go on. It may not even be baseball, but the fact that it appears in a story associated with two people that were related to each other at the time gives me a little bit of confidence in its veracity. And we do know of other baseball type incidents in Canada. One totally unrelated to Ontario was in New Brunswick that David Block uncovered from May 1793. And my particular favorite is 1819 in Hamilton, which predates the famous Beachville game that we talk so much about up here by 19 years, and actually talks about playing the old style of baseball on the 4th of June, George III's birthday, and is, in my mind, the best possible corroboration I could find for the June 4th, 1838 game in Beachville, Ontario as well. And it was, June 4th was essentially a day when you marched around and pretended to be a soldier, but really it was an excuse to have delectable drink, as it says here, made by mixing rye whiskey and West Indian molasses, and together was a most deceiving beverage. I'm sure it was. So here's our friend Bob Addy, shown in his online biography as being batting left and throwing left. And in the upper corner are in fact, I found 5 incidents of Bob Addy playing cricket in Port Hope. And I'm sure there's more. I just haven't had an opportunity to get out and spend more time in the Port Hope Evening Guide, where I found these particular ones. What was problematic for this, of course, was that Bob Addy is shown as batting and throwing left, but in the cricket match on the right, it says right hand, and Addy is shown as a batter in that particular side. So my only thought is that, in fact, when they say right hand in the cricket, what they're really referring to is the bowling team, i.e. the pitching team, and not the batting team. As if not, it just messes up even more, whether he really was left or right-handed or was in fact ambidextrous. No, I suspect that the right-handed that it shows and then left-handed down below is in fact for the bowling side and not for the hitting side. This is one of the cricket matches that our Bob was in. It's notable only because of the name Strickland that appears on the Peterborough team that was playing against Addy, and Mr. Strickland actually bowled out Bob Addy in the game. Strickland is notable because he was the son of this guy in the upper left-hand corner, Samuel Strickland, who was one of the noted cricketers in England before he came to Canada, and whose 2 sisters were the famous Susanna Moodie and Catherine Partrail, which perhaps most listeners will not be familiar with. But in fact, Susanna Moodie was
Hi, Bill. It sounds like you muted yourself.
There's something happening. I'm trying to send him a message to unmute himself. Bill?
There I am. Am I hearable now?
Yes, sir.
Did you hear my Samantha Bee story?
No.
Oh, geez. Anyway, Samantha Bee talked about Susanna Moody and how inspirational it was to her in an age of struggle and impending apocalypse. I won't go any further on that one, but here is the one that the note that was problematic to me. And that was this account that appeared in the New York Clipper on the 25th of August, 1861, with a team from Bowmanville, where I live, the Live Oak, against the Mechanics of Port Hope. And there was an Addy in the lineup. It's not spelled the same, but it does talk about him as being a very fine player and a very powerful batter. And we've seen references in the cricket, at least I have, to him being a great batter as well. As well, there were no other Addies in Port Hope other than the two that are shown in this town directory from a few years before. One of them is Mrs. Addy, Ellen Addy. She was the mother of George, Robert, and James Addy, and she was a widow by this time. And George, who was a clerk who had eventually moved to Illinois and start our Bob Addy on his Major League Baseball trail. So I was almost convinced that this was not, unfortunately, that this may or may not be our Bob Addy until, okay, here we are. So this came up. Oh, I will go back. This came up. This was a genealogy site. And at the bottom of the genealogy site, and I'm sure all of us as researchers run into this at times, there was a piece called Robert Addy, Boston baseball player, born Port Hope, bio. And I was almost certain that this was probably something that I already knew about, that I'd seen. Probably it could have come from George Wright's book done around this time, 1874. But in the interest of research, I sent my $20 to Michael Stevenson, who was the owner of this particular item. And it turned out to be the best investment, one of the best investments I made, because it in fact had this little piece from 1873 that James Addy, his younger brother, Robert's younger brother, brought into the local paper in Port Hope and indicated that Bob had indeed, according to this item, played for the Mechanics Baseball Club. 1858 seems a little early, but I'm prepared to accept that it would have been around that time. He does get, the author of this piece does get his birth wrong. He was born in 1842. I don't think there's not much doubt about that. But mistakes are a common feature. We know of accounts about baseball and many things from this particular area. And it gave a really nice overview of Bob's career in the United States after he had moved to the Rockford area. So why did he move to Rockford? Well, his older brother, George, had moved to Ogle County in Illinois sometime in the late 1850s, probably early 1860s. And I can only assume that one of the reasons he went was because there was something called the Canada Settlement there in Ogle County near Rochelle, Illinois. And it seems likely that there was some family connection between people who were there and the Addy family back in Port Hope. And confirming that for me was the fact that many of these people seemed to have fled Canada after their unsuccessful rebellion of 1837 and had taken up a residence in Illinois. Many of these people actually were originally people that had fled the United States after the British had lost the American Revolution. And in the Upper Canada Rebellion, effectively the British won. And so I almost think in some ways that these people were great examples of what Oscar Wilde once said about those who are orphans, that to lose one parent, or in this case, one revolution, seems misfortune, but to lose 2 seems like carelessness. And that may have been a factor in George heading to Ogle County in Illinois. And pretty soon, he was encouraging his younger brother, Robert, to join him. And Robert was at the time, was in deep training to become a tinsmith, which he may or may not have completed the work that he had to do to become a tinsmith in Canada. You were required to go on the road, as it were, and sell the wares of your, in effect, master, to whom you learned the trade from. He may have done that, or he may have objected to having to do that, or he may have thought there were better opportunities to do that as a tinsmith in Ogle County, or he may simply have been pursuing the direction that his older brother had taken. In any case, you can see number 13 on this list is Robert Addy, 21, in the upper right-hand corner, 1863. Abraham Lincoln had determined that all young men were obliged to register for the Army, regardless of whether they ever were drafted into it or ever went into the Army. And so despite the fact that Robert had recently arrived, and you can see his place of birth, he quite clearly says he was from Canada, he registered for the draft. Whether he actually was in the war, I don't think so. I haven't found record of it, but it's always possible. So this is the game where fate intervenes. And you might say that Bob Addy ending up in Rochelle, he was fated for this fate, because just north of Rochelle is Rockford, Illinois. And in 1866, as we can see here, Robert and his older brother, George, played a game for the Rochelle Clipper team against the forest city of Rockford that featured Albert Spalding, among others, that would be on the team in the future. And clearly Robert impressed Al Spalding to no extent. And by 1867, when Forest City defeats the Nationals of Washington, which John Thorne calls, perhaps with a question mark, he says maybe one of the most important games in baseball history, because it allowed, it showed that a team from the West could at least match the talent of a team from the East. And Addy was on that team, Al Spalding was on that team, Ross Barnes was on that team, a number of the future stars of that particular team were there. So here's Bob in 1870. He's the guy up here. That's Bob. And that was the year that Bob got married. And his teammate, Vic Wheeler, and himself had been attracted by 2 young ladies, the Seeley girls, who would come by the ballpark. Vic married the older one. Bob married the younger one, Iva. Iva was at most 15. Bob was at most 28 at the time. Iva may have been 14. We don't know her birth date, so it's unclear, but she was young, and it's a little peculiar, I guess we could say. Bob's record throughout the 1870s, and we should point out by the 1870s, Bob was, I mean, he was into his 30s now. He was born in 1842. His best years would obviously have been in his 20s. We have no records of him playing other than that 1861 game in Port Hope, and then again 1866 in Rochelle, Illinois. Undoubtedly, he did play cricket or baseball or something of the sort, but it was at a level that would not have been recorded for the time. So there isn't a lot to go on with Bob Addy, and Peter Morris acknowledges this in his biography of Bob. It's hard to kind of pin it down. And so what stats we do have for him from the 1870s are probably of a player somewhat in decline, who had a great reputation and a great friendship with many of the ball players. You can see that 1873, he's with Boston of the National Association, the Boston Red Stockings. 1876, he's with the Chicago team in the Chicago White Stockings at the first season of the National League. He's well thought of. He's considered a spirited man who could be funny and could also inspire his teammates when they were down or not so positive about the prospects of a game. And here we have him in the lineup of the 1876 pennant-winning Chicago White Stockings. So Bob, if there's a number of comments that are made about him, he was talkative on the Forest Cities. It's the comment here, this is a story in 1930, but he was an expert sheet metal worker by trade, and boys would climb to the roofs while he was tinning under an August sun to listen to his ceaseless chatter, which was more witty and clever than the routine of most professional monologists. We like to think that Canadians breed an inordinate number of comedians who've made their mark in the United States. And Bob Addy apparently was the first among that breed who crossed the border and made his mark in that manner. Everyone knew Bob was a Canadian. The Canadian Gentleman's Journal, sporting journal, in the upper left-hand corner was very clear that Bob Addy, the Canadian ball player, states quite clearly he was. So why was Bob, what turned Bob, what problem did he have with Canada? Because later in his life, of course, he would make a considerable effort to hide his history, to hide his background, to hide his heritage, to the point that when his daughter from his second marriage sent a letter to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown describing her father's life and exploits, virtually every fact in the letter was wrong. Bob had done a pretty good job of deceiving her as to his birth year, his birthplace, and a number of other factors. One factor seems to be at a game in Hamilton, he was kidded unmercifully by his teammates when the fans started cheering for him because he was a Canadian. And some of the fans were a little coarse. They were a little hayseedy, shall we say, a little bit, shall we call them rubes, other words to describe them. They weren't necessarily the sort that Bob might now want to associate with, nor would he want to be kidded as someone other than a good old boy like the rest of his teammates on the team. So this may have been a factor in his changing attitude. The other story, of course, is the Kansas City Contemporary is authority for the statement that the well-known veteran Bob Addy is now a Mormon with 12 wives. I think that story can be discounted, but we do know that Bob did go to Salt Lake City and played with a baseball team there, the Deserettes, in 1879. So he did have some connection there. His last season in what we would think of as Major League Baseball was that 1877 season. But Bob was an industrious, I should say, and a promoter. And he started Bob Addy's skating rink in Chicago. Al Spalding even played in the game. Bob didn't. I would have thought that a good old boy from Canada would have at least put on the skates and made an effort to show off. Although clearly in 1877, 78, hockey as an organized game in Canada simply didn't exist. There would be crude forms of it available on open ponds, but there was no organized hockey of any sort. So Bob's desire to start a skating rink and have a baseball game there obviously was fed by his interest in skating. Now here's where Peter Morris tells us about Ida. She was alive according to this, but otherwise she remains a mysterious figure. Well, we cannot be identified, nor is anything known about what became of her after Bob moved west. It wasn't sounding good in this particular account, and it gets even worse when we read this. Among the cases that will come up in the April term is a case against Robert Addy, the well-known baseball professional. They were married in 1870, so that's confirmed. They have a 6-year-old child, also named George. The grounds are numerous: adulteries, kicked her, sharpened his razor and threatened to take her life, lay down in front of the door prohibiting her passing. The defendant is now in Evanston, Wyoming territory and will not set up a defense, it is said. If all the bill alleges is true, Bob is a brute and a villain and deserves to suffer something worse than separation from a bright, intelligent, and long-suffering wife. And here we have the census of 1880 with Bob and George. The name is spelled wrong, but it is our Bob Addy. George was a 7-year-old son, and there's no sign of Ida. This is not looking good. Back in Port Hope, meanwhile, they still remember Bob, the Wandering Boys. This is from the 1889 issue. There is a little piece down there saying Robert Addy is now in New York. These two are probated wills. George and Robert's younger brother, James Addy, who was also a cricketer, also a baseball player, but who remained at home. He remained at home with mom, Ellen. He died in 1886, and George Addy oversaw this probated will. And in 1889, Ellen, their mother, she died, also in Port Hope. And Bob Addy, now living in Wyoming Territory, he oversaw or was the executor for her will. Again, just one more example of the connection that they had to Port Hope, Ontario. So this is where Bob ends his days, in Pocatello, Idaho. This is Pocatello in 1891. It really has a kind of an Old West feature character to it, with the mountains in the background. Here's the store that Bob and his son George ran, a hardware store, one of Pocatello's first business firms. And here's the last game that we have a record of for Bob playing, from the Salt Lake Herald in 1899. Bob started out playing for the Fats. This was in Pocatello. And by the end of the game, he was playing for the Leans, which I can only assume means that either he lost an incredible amount of weight during the game and so was forced to change sides, or they felt with an old-time ball player in the stands in the lineup, he should have, at least each team should get a chance to play with him. And in 1910, Bob dies. He's well remembered, of course, back in Rockford. And Peter states unequivocally that while we have less extensive statistics, Bob was in his prime. The available records show that he deserved to be regarded as one of the game's best players from this era. We know in reading box scores of that era that basically all we get are hands out and runs scored. So it's not particularly helpful a lot of times. And he was credited by many, some, a few, being the first to slide. I suspect really what this means, he was one of the first to master it, but he probably wasn't. Trying to say anybody is the first, a little silly. The funny thing about this picture is it appeared in Canadian newspapers right across the country in 1930, and not one of them mentioned that this Bob Addy, this famous man, ever to employ the slide in stealing a base, was one of their own, was a Canadian. Which of course brings us to Ida. What happened to Ida? This is where we get into the fortuitousness of research, because we wouldn't have known what happened to Ida except that she remarried. She remarried a guy named Jerry Kinney, who was a conductor on the Oregon Short Line, and who, to his credit, had jumped out of his train at some point and saved the life of a man who was drowning. Not, I might add, the man in the bottom right-hand corner of the story, which if you read it, you'll see wife talk, man suicide. Apparently he got provoked because his wife insisted on talking to him at 2 o'clock in the morning. Edward Goddard, a carpenter, dressed himself and ran and jumped in the Androscoggin River. His body was recovered. That has nothing to do with our story, but it is such a bizarre little piece in the bottom right-hand corner. I couldn't leave it out. But what it does tell us, the story, is that Ida Seeley, once the wife of Bob Addy, had also moved to Pocatello, Idaho, because her 7-year-old son, or now 17-year-old son, was living there. And she had married Jerry Kinney. And because Jerry had saved the life of this person, we found out a lot more about Ida than we would have ever have known about had he not saved their life. And intriguingly enough, it does tell us about Vic Wheeler, the older fellow who married Ida's older sister, that he was a Grand Army of the Republic veteran. and his wife was a member of the Women's Relief Corps, which may suggest that possibly Bob might have had some involvement in the Army. I found no record of it, but it's always possible. And as for Ida, she dismissed the complainant with costs, the divorce, probably because she was pregnant with young Jerry. Jerry and her and Jerry Kinney's young son, and they had a whole bunch of children, as you can see. She lived well into the 20th century, and she lived till 1938 and is buried in Pocatello, Idaho. So I just want to close a little bit on this kind of sidebar about the Addy family, because they're a pretty extraordinary bunch. George Addy, the older brother, had decided at some point to send his 20-something daughter, Sarah, back to Port Hope to marry a 50-something widower, George Redding. And George, they produced 7 or 8 kids. George dropped dead the day after Christmas 1902. Sarah headed west. She got in a messy legal issue somewhere in the West, ended up living the rest of her years in San Diego, where she died, and is really not germane to the story. Who is germane, though? Sorry, I'll go back. Who is germane, though, is Bob Addy's niece and Sarah's younger sister, Jane Addy, who was a noted singer in Chicago. And she wasn't going to end up like her older sister, married off to some 50-year-old guy in Port Hope, Ontario. So she took off for England, and she caught the eye of Arthur Sullivan and the Doyley Cart Company, famed for the Gilbert and Sullivan productions. And she became a noted singer in London at that time. Meanwhile, in the South Pole, the Belgique had sailed from Belgium with 2 noted people on board, a number of noted people, scientists, Henryk Arctowski, a Polish meteorologist, and Roald Amundsen, who would be the first man eventually to go to the South Pole. They got stuck in the South Pole. It appears the captain deliberately had them frozen in, and so they had to spend an entire winter there, what passed for a winter in the South Pole, trucking around, eating penguins, drinking tea, and quite frankly, being bored to tears, so that they finally ended up cutting out all the magazines they had brought with them. And as you can see, S.M. Artochko at the top and S.A. Roald below him are not very well hidden, as Mr. Arctowski and Roald Amundsen rated all of the women in these magazines from Europe. This is about 1898, 97 magazines, on a whole bunch of characteristics. Legion, mouth, most beautiful face, sporty girls, underclothing. I don't know how they got that one in 1897. Irreproachable character, grace personified. At the end of this, Henryk Arctowski fell in love with Jane Addy's picture and made his way back to Paris, where he wooed her and married her. And the Arctowskis became noted for their friendship with Robert Scott, who was the ill-fated guy who reached the South Pole several weeks after Amundsen. Mr. Scott gave something like a scarf to Jane Addy as a memento of his friendship for the Arctowskis, but he never made it back to ever celebrate it. That's not Jane in the upper. That's Robert Scott's wife, the noted Kathleen Lloyd Bruce. I don't know who she is, but anyway, she was famous. Eventually, the Arctowskis became noted in Poland in the 1920s and 30s, to the point that Jane Addy, translated many books of Polish into English to raise the profile of Poland in the United States. And in 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, the Arctowskis, or Arctowska, would have been prime candidates to be eliminated because intellectuals were killed off in pretty quick order by the Germans, except that they were at a conference in the United States in Washington in 1939 when it happened. So they would spend the rest of their lives in the United States. Both died in 1958. Both had their bodies interred and flown, or they were returned to Poland, and they are buried in a cemetery in Poland, and Jane Addy Arctowska is there. Henryk Artowski is a noted person in Poland to this day, and there's an Antarctic station named after him. This doesn't have a whole lot to do with Bob Addy, but it's such a wonderful sidebar that I couldn't resist. So Bob Addy was not to be outdone in terms of his acclaim. I've got about 2 minutes more here, and I will finish. He is now part of a self-guided tour that you can take of the Pocatello Historic Preservation Commission. Number 3 on the list is 507 North Garfield. This large 2-story home has elements of exaggerated scale, such as the columns, some of which are out of period. The low-pitched roof harkens to the prairie, the rounded bay encircling porch, and fenestration to the Victorian. Notice the elaborate trim medallions on the windows. Robert Addy, he wasn't a ball player. They didn't make a big deal of that. Robert Addy was a tinner. And if you go to, if you push this button and, no. There we are. There's Bob Addy's house to this day at 507 North Garfield in Pocatello, Idaho. And to quote the inimitable Paul Harvey, and now you know the rest of the story. Thank you.
Bill, one question came up from Marilyn Miller. The year 1872 was missing from the chronology of his National Association and beyond. What happened? Peter Morris made a note following that a number of Western teams had dropped out due to the Great Chicago Fire. Can you add anything to that?
Well, Rockford was only in the National Association in 1871, and they lost Cap Anson. He left the team, and there wasn't obviously the resources to continue on. So I think Bob, Bob was now 30. He was now married. I think he made a decision to go back to Rockford and begin a new career. He was obviously encouraged to return to the major league scene, as it were, in 1873. That would be my conclusion.
Also, David Paulson sent a note that there was a Bob Addy, spelled A-D-D-I-E, who was a sports writer for the Washington Post. I remember reading him in the Sporting News in the 50s and 60s. He was probably before that thing. So Bob Addy continued in the sports world one way or another.
Well, and there was also a Bob Addy who was either an Australian or English cyclist. So many times when you bring up the name Bob Addy, there'd be a picture of a guy on a bicycle. And I said, what is that? It turns out Bob actually got involved with bicycling in Rockford and was one of the early initiators of owning a bicycle in 1869 when the first velocipedes were sold.
Very good. If you would close off the slides, we'll get the view of all the people back.
Okay.
And Peter, if you would like to give us our close.
Okay. No, I don't want to share. How do I kill this off? Oh,
There you go. Got it. Peter, unmute.
Someone had made a comment that in that early game between Cincinnati and Forest City, there was a double steal in the 9th inning that put across, I think, one of those runs. The other I wanted to ask you, Bill, was well, let me, before I ask the question, somebody also commented on the chat that Addy's wife was a tennis champion. Do you know anything about that?
That's the sports writer's wife.
Okay. That's the
Bob
sports
Addy of the
writer's wife.
Washington
Okay.
Post.
Okay. And that was the Addy they were referring to. Okay. I also wanted to ask if Port Hope came to Rochester on July 4th.
yes.
Did Rochester go to Port Hope on July 1st?
No, that July 1st didn't come into Canadian history until 1867.
Okay, I was wondering that.
By then, Bob was long gone from town. In fact, the Port Hopes, they would go over by boat, and during the Civil War, they would sing, you know, Dixie and songs like that, just to start fights on the streets of Rochester. So they were kind of they were a rough group. It was a different crowd than we expect today. You go to Port Hope today, it's a beautiful little town. It's Cooperstownish. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. You know, it has that charm associated with it. In the 19th century, when Bob was there, it would have been known for its rye whiskey and all of its beer making factories.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank Bill. Any other questions? If anyone wants to unmute or ask a question, you're welcome to. Okay.
I was just going to say about Bob Addy's wife, Pauline, she was a Wimbledon champion. She's in the Tennis Hall of Fame, and she won 3 U.S. Open. They didn't call it the U.S. Open at that time, but she won 3 of those. She played before the Open era in tennis. But,
That was the other Bob Addy.
yeah,
Right.
ADDIE.
Yeah. What era? What years were they?
I'm thinking it was probably in the late 40s, early 50s, I'd say, around then.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a native to Staten Island, of course, and Mary Outerbridge was inducted into the Staten Island Sports Hall of Fame for introducing lawn tennis in the United States.
She's also in the National Tennis Hall of Fame, although Frank Phelps told me many times he shuddered when he thought of that.
And by the way, it's not the Goethals Bridge, I'm sorry, it's not the Outer Bridge. It's actually the Outer Bridge Crossing, because the name of the engineer was Mary Outerbridge's father, and his name was Outer Bridge.
So it's the Outer Bridge Bridge.
Anyway, thought I'd add that. Bill, I want to thank you.
That was back when they used to name things after people instead of after corporations.
Yeah, exactly.
In the good old days.
I know that voice.
Although to their credit, in Naples, they've renamed their soccer stadium after Diego Maradona. So there's still a few, you know, people with concern for the history of sports. So.
Bill, I want to thank you so much for putting this together and expanding a little bit of our knowledge on Bob Addy. And I wish you and your family a happy holiday and a safe one too, please.
Cheers.
I want to say a few more things. What's coming up here in January? Our next presenter, I don't know if he's still online here. He was here in attendance. Was Tom Schieber from the Baseball Hall of Fame, and he is going to do a presentation. Tom is the type of person who doesn't just work at the Hall of Fame. He actually takes the artifacts and can really study them and really come to some conclusions about them. And am I still on here?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, my screen went white. But anyway, if you can still hear me, Tom is going to do a presentation on Spalding's 1888-89 World Tour and a diary that was kept. Can I still be heard?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know why my screen went just completely white, so I don't know what I have here. But anyway, so Tom will be, that'll be in January, I think on the 12th. Our February presentation is going to feature Don Jensen, who's going to do a presentation on somebody he has researched the life out of. Harry Stevens, the hot dog king, who really introduced modern sports catering and, you know, concessions. And coming up finally in March, that's in February, then finally in March, we have Jerry Casway doing a presentation entitled Before There Was Greenberg, There Was Pike. And of course, it's about the famous Jewish ball player of the 19th century, Lippman Pike, who had a very interesting career that spanned the pre-professional and professional era. And then Bob and I will be working a little bit more on our April and May presentations before we take our summer hiatus here. So Bob, if that's okay, want to wish everybody a safe and happy holiday season.
Same to you, Peter.
Best to y'all.
Yep.
Thanks for tuning in tonight. Y'all have a good time. Bye now.
Good
Bye-bye.
stuff.
Great to
Take
see
care.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
I think I have the book.
Oh, here I am. Thanks all.
Night.
Night.
Hey,
Bye now. Enjoy this holiday. I wear my Red Sox one.
Hey, good for you.
I know you have. I know you have to like that, Joanne.
Yeah, I do. I really like that. That's very good. Well,
Ian.
that was a very good production tonight.
Mr. Miller has his Bean Eaters shirt.
Ian, I sent you an email. If you could reply, I would appreciate it when you get a chance. I got. Oh, there's another shirt. Thank you again.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye. I'm off.
Good night.